August 1st, 1944, Normandy, France. The rain had not stopped for 3 days. In a canvas command tent, General Omar Nelson Bradley stood over a tactical map, his hands trembling slightly as they pressed against the folded edges. He had just made a decision that would either end his career or birth a legend. He had unleashed George S. Patton, Jr., a general who wore ivory-handled revolver, quoted Caesar, and believed speed was a weapon. What followed in the next 30 days would shatter every assumption about modern warfare. This is the story of what Bradley confessed years later, about the moment he realized Patton wasn't just fast, he was impossible. It was August 1st, 1944, and the hedgerows of Normandy stood like ancient fortresses, their roots tangled deep into the French soil, their branches woven tight as wire. The fields beyond Avranches smelled of turned earth and diesel fuel, of canvas and sweat, and something else, something electric, unspoken, the scent of a door about to open. In the command tent of the U.S. First Army, General Omar Nelson Bradley stood over a map spread across a folding table, his hands flat on either side of it, his eyes tracing the narrow corridor his forces had just carved through the German lines. Outside, the engines of Sherman tanks coughed to life. Inside, Bradley's stomach turned. He had made a decision. It was the kind of decision that ends careers or births legends, and in that moment, he could not yet tell which it would be. He had just unleashed George S. Patton, Jr., a man equal parts genius and catastrophe, a general who wore ivory-handled revolvers and quoted Caesar and believed in reincarnation, who had slapped soldiers and insulted allies, and who now commanded the newly operational U.S. Third Army. Bradley had opened the gate, and Patton, like a racehorse, held too long at the post, exploded through it. What followed would rewrite the doctrine of modern warfare. It would shatter German defensive lines, collapse entire army groups, and drive Allied forces across France at a pace no one, not Eisenhower, not Montgomery, not even Bradley himself, had imagined possible. Within 30 days, Patton's Third Army would advance over 400 miles, liberate dozens of towns, capture tens of thousands of prisoners, and reach the outskirts of the German border while other Allied armies were still clearing villages 20 miles from the beaches. But this is not a story about Patton alone. This is a story about what Omar Bradley confessed in the months and years that followed, about the moment he realized that the man he had unleashed was not simply fast, he was impossible, and about the terrible, beautiful secret that made it all happen. A revolution in logistics, in fuel, in roads, in maps, in radios, in 1,000 invisible sinews of supply and coordination that allowed one man's audacity to become an entire army's velocity. This is the story of what speed really costs, and what it buys. In the summer of 1944, the Western Front was not supposed to move quickly. The lessons of the Great War still haunted the Allied High Command. Trench warfare, attrition, static lines, the Somme, Verdun, Passchendaele. Those names were synonyms for slaughter, for futility, for the grinding calculus of men against mud. Even after the Americans and British had broken out of the Normandy beachhead at the end of July, Operation Cobra, a stunning success. Caution still governed planning. The maps showed terrain laced with rivers, choked with forests, studded with fortified towns. The logisticians spoke in terms of tonnage and rail capacity and port throughput. The intelligence officers warned of panzer reserves and SS divisions and the inevitable counterattack. No one planned for a chase, but Patton did. George Patton had spent 2 years in exile, after Sicily, after the slapping incidents, after Eisenhower dressed him down, and the press devoured him. Patton had been sidelined, reduced to commanding a phantom army in southeast England, a deception operation designed to convince the Germans that the real invasion would come at Calais. He had played his role. He had waited, and he had seethed. While other men led, Patton studied maps, read history, and honed his philosophy of war into something sharp and singular. Speed is a weapon. Speed disorients. Speed demoralizes. Speed kills more surely than firepower because it denies the enemy time to think, to regroup, to dig in. Speed transforms an advance into a rout. Bradley knew this. He had served with Patton in North Africa and Sicily. He had watched Patton move armies, like a conductor moves an orchestra, not with caution, but with rhythm, with crescendo, with an almost musical violence. And Bradley, calm and methodical and Midwestern to his core, had always been the steady hand that tempered Patton's impulses. But now, standing over that map in Avranches, Bradley saw something he had not expected to see. Opportunity. The German 7th Army was collapsing. The breakout from Normandy had punched a hole in their lines, and instead of closing it, the Germans were retreating east in disarray. The roads were open. The weather, though miserable, would not stop tanks, and Patton's Third Army, fresh, fueled, and spoiling for a fight, was positioned perfectly to exploit it. Bradley gave the order. Third Army would advance south into Brittany to secure the ports, then wheel east toward the Seine. It was an ambitious plan. Patton ignored half of it. He sent one corps into Brittany, enough to fulfill the letter of Bradley's directive, and threw the rest of his army east toward the heart of France. He did not ask permission. He did not wait for clarification. He simply moved. By August 7th, elements of the Third Army had covered 60 miles. By August 10th, they had liberated Le Mans, a city 130 miles from the start line. By August 15th, they were approaching Orléans, another 70 miles beyond. The German commanders could not understand what was happening. Their intelligence reports spoke of entire American divisions appearing in places they should not have been, vanishing before counterattacks could form, reappearing 50 miles away the next day. It was not warfare. It was haunting. Bradley watched this unfold from his headquarters, and slowly, a realization began to dawn on him, one he would later struggle to put into words, one that mixed pride with something closer to fear. Patton was not outpacing the Germans. He was outpacing everyone. There is a photograph from that August, taken somewhere in eastern France, of a Third Army supply, convoy stretching back as far as the lens could see, trucks, jeeps, half-tracks, tankers, an unbroken river of olive-drab metal flowing east, their wheels churning dust into the sky, their drivers leaning out windows, their faces smeared with grime and grinning. The photograph does not show the destination. It does not need to. The destination was always the same, forward. To understand what Patton's Third Army achieved, you must first understand what it consumed. A single armored division in 1944 required on average 300,000 gallons of fuel per day. It required ammunition, shells for its tanks, bullets for its infantry, grenades, mortar rounds, explosives. It required food, water, medical supplies, spare parts, tires, oil, grease, radios, maps, boots, socks, cigarettes, mail from home. A division did not move on courage alone. It moved on an industrial torrent of material, channeled across oceans and beaches and roads and fields, delivered with relentless precision to the men who needed it, when they needed it, where they needed it. Patton's Third Army consisted of 6 divisions at the start of August. By September, it had grown to 12. At its peak, it numbered over 300,000 men, and Patton drove them forward at a pace that shattered every logistical assumption the U.S. Army had made. The textbook said an army could advance 10 to 15 miles per day in pursuit. Patton's forces regularly covered 30. On some days, they covered 50. On one extraordinary 48-hour period in late August, elements of the 4th Armored Division advanced 75 miles, liberated 3 towns, and destroyed an entire German supply depot before the enemy even knew they were there. The speed was intoxicating. It was also impossible, except it wasn't. Behind Patton's advance, unseen, unsung, and utterly vital, was the most sophisticated logistical operation in the history of warfare. It had a name, the Red Ball Express. It had a mission to keep Patton moving, and it had a secret. It worked. The Red Ball Express was born out of desperation. By late August, the Allied advance had outstripped its supply lines. The ports of Normandy, Cherbourg, Saint-Lô could not handle the volume of material required. The French rail network had been destroyed by Allied bombing. The Seine bridges were rubble. The only way to move supplies was by truck, and there were not enough trucks, not enough drivers, not enough roads. So the U.S. Army improvised. It commandeered every vehicle it could find. It recruited drivers from rear echelon units, many of them African-American soldiers, from segregated quartermaster companies, men who had been denied combat roles but who now found themselves thrust into a different kind of battle, a race against time, against distance, against the physics of supply and demand. The Red Ball Express ran 24 hours a day, convoys stretched for miles, their headlights cutting through the night, their drivers pushing themselves past exhaustion. They drove without maps, following hand-painted signs, red balls on white backgrounds that marked the route east. They drove through rain and mud and enemy fire. They drove until their trucks broke down, then abandoned them and kept driving. They delivered fuel to tank columns that had outrun their supply depots by 100 miles. They delivered ammunition to artillery batteries that were firing on targets the maps said were still behind German lines. They delivered the war itself, one truckload at a time, and Patton knew it. He visited their camps, shook their hands, called them the unsung heroes of his army. He understood better than most generals that speed was not a function of courage alone. It was a function of gasoline, of tires, of the unglamorous grinding work of men who drove trucks instead of tanks, but who made the tanks possible. Bradley understood it too, but Bradley also understood something else, something that gnawed at him as he watched Patton's advance accelerate beyond all prediction, beyond all control. He understood that Patton was burning through resources faster than they could be replaced, that the Red Ball Express, miraculous as it was, could not sustain this pace forever, that sooner or later the fuel would run out, the ammunition would run dry, and the advance would stop. And when it stopped, the Germans would have time to regroup, to fortify, to turn the war back into the grinding, attritional nightmare everyone had feared. Bradley did not say this out loud, not yet, but in his private writings, in his memoirs, in interviews conducted years later, he would return again and again to that summer, to that moment when Patton's Third Army became something more than an army. It became a force of nature, unstoppable and uncontrollable, a whirlwind that Bradley had unleashed and could no longer contain. And he would confess, quietly, reluctantly, that he had been afraid. August 15th, 1944, Orléans. The city fell without a fight. By the time German commanders realized Third Army units were approaching, it was too late to organize a defense. Reconnaissance patrols rolled into the city center in the early morning, their tank commanders standing in open hatches, waving to French civilians who poured into the streets, weeping, shouting, pressing flowers and wine into the hands of American soldiers who looked as stunned as they were exhausted. The Stars and Stripes was raised over the city hall. The Germans retreated east toward the Loire. Patton arrived hours later. He stood in the plaza, hands on his hips, surveying the scene with the expression of a man who had just won a bet. His staff officers hurried to catch up. Their maps already outdated, their plans already obsolete. Patton turned to one of them, a young captain whose name would not survive the historical record, and said something that would. "We're not chasing them," Patton said. "We're eating them. Alive." He was right. By mid-August, the German army in France was disintegrating. The Falaise pocket had closed days earlier, trapping tens of thousands of German troops in a killing zone south of Caen. Those who escaped fled east, but they did not flee in formation. They fled in chaos, on foot, in commandeered trucks, on bicycles, on horses requisitioned from French farms. They abandoned equipment, they abandoned wounded, they abandoned hope, and behind them, relentless as a tide, came Patton. Third Army units reached the Seine on August 19th. They crossed it on August 20th. By August 25th, Paris was liberated, not by Patton, but by the French 2nd Armored Division under General Leclerc, with Patton's forces screening to the south and east, cutting off German escape routes. Patton did not pause to celebrate. He barely paused at all. By the end of the month, his forward elements were approaching the Marne, 200 miles from where they had started. The Germans called it der Amerikaner Blitzkrieg, the American Blitzkrieg. The irony was not lost on them. 5 years earlier, they had pioneered the doctrine of mobile warfare, using tanks and aircraft and radio communication to paralyze Allied defenses in Poland, in France, in the Soviet Union. They had written the manual on speed. Now, the Americans were using it against them and doing it better. But there was a difference. The German Blitzkrieg had relied on surprise, on overwhelming local superiority, on the gamble that enemies would break before logistics ran out. It was a philosophy of war built on risk, on momentum, on the edge of a knife. The American version was different. It was not a gamble. It was a system. Behind Patton's tanks was not chaos, but infrastructure, not improvisation, but planning. The Red Ball Express, the C-47 transport planes dropping fuel and ammunition by parachute, the engineering battalions building Bailey bridges over rivers before the tanks even reached them, the signal corps stringing telephone wire across liberated France, creating a communications network that allowed Patton to coordinate 6 divisions spread across 100 miles as easily as a battalion commander controlled 6 companies. The Germans had invented Blitzkrieg, the Americans industrialized it, and Bradley, watching from headquarters, began to realize the implications. This was not just a successful offensive, it was a revolution. The U.S. Army had solved the oldest problem in warfare: how to sustain an advance, how to keep an army fed, fueled, and fighting while moving at full speed. The British could not do it. Montgomery's forces were still methodically clearing northern France, their supply lines taut, their progress measured. The Soviets could not do it. Their advances in the east were massive but ponderous, reliant on railroads and horse-drawn carts. Only the Americans, with their vast industrial capacity, their fleets of trucks, their oceans of fuel, their endless factories, churning out tires and rations and ammunition, could do it, and only Patton had the audacity to try. September 1st, 1944, Verdun. The name carried weight. In 1916, Verdun had been the site of the longest, bloodiest battle of the First World War. 10 months of slaughter that consumed 700,000 men and became a symbol of everything senseless and static about that conflict. Now, 28 years later, American tanks rolled through its streets in a single afternoon. The Germans did not defend it. They could not. By the time they realized Third Army was approaching, Patton's forces were already past it, racing toward Metz, toward the German border, toward the Rhine. Bradley flew to Patton's headquarters that week. It was a small chateau near Nancy, requisitioned from a French aristocrat who had fled years earlier. The walls were lined with maps, their surfaces covered in grease pencil marks, tracing Third Army's advance. Patton stood in the center of the room, gesturing broadly, his voice booming, his energy undiminished despite weeks of constant movement. He wanted to keep going. He wanted to cross the Rhine before the Germans could fortify it. He wanted to end the war by Christmas. Bradley listened, and then for the first time since Normandy, he said no. The supplies had run out. Not completely, not yet. But the Red Ball Express was faltering. The trucks were breaking down faster than they could be repaired. The fuel depots were running dry. The ports, Antwerp, had not yet been cleared. Marseille was still in German hands, could not keep up. Every gallon of gasoline delivered to Third Army was a gallon taken from another unit. Every shell, every ration, every spare part was now part of a zero-sum calculation. The logisticians had done the math. Patton's advance could not continue, not at this pace, not without risking the collapse of the entire supply network. Patton argued, he raged, he pleaded, he invoked Stonewall Jackson, Napoleon, Alexander the Great. He said the Germans were beaten, that one more push would finish them, that stopping now would give them time to recover. He was probably right. Bradley held firm. Years later, in his memoirs, Bradley would write about that conversation with a tone of regret and relief mingled together. He would describe Patton as the best pursuit commander in the history of warfare, a man whose instincts for exploitation were unmatched, whose ability to inspire and drive his men bordered on the supernatural. But he would also write about the crushing weight of command, the impossible choices, the knowledge that armies do not run on instinct alone. They run on fuel, on ammunition, on the cold arithmetic of supply and demand. And he would confess something else. He would confess that in that moment, part of him had wanted to let Patton go, to give him every truck, every gallon, every shell, and see how far he could get, to find out if one man's audacity, backed by American industry, could truly end the war in 1944. But Bradley was not that kind of gambler. He was a realist, a logistician, a general who understood that wars are won not by brilliant offensives alone, but by the grinding, patient accumulation of resources and position. So, he stopped Patton, and the war did not end in 1944. There is a danger in mythologizing speed. Speed seduces. It thrills. It creates the illusion of inevitability, of destiny unfolding in real time. Patton's advance across France in the summer of 1944 has been immortalized in books and films, in histories and lectures, as the perfect expression of American warfare. Aggressive, mobile, relentless. And it was. But it was also unsustainable. By September, Third Army had outrun its supply lines by 200 miles. Tanks sat motionless in French fields, their fuel tanks empty, their crews waiting for the Red Ball Express to catch up. Artillery batteries rationed shells. Infantry units marched on half rations. Patton's divisions, which had covered 400 miles in 30 days, now struggled to advance 10. The Germans, granted time to breathe, began to fortify the West Wall, the belt of fortifications along the German border. What had been a rout became a siege. Bradley would later call this the tyranny of logistics. No matter how brilliant the plan, no matter how bold the commander, no matter how courageous the soldiers, an army could only move as fast as its supply lines allowed. The Red Ball Express had performed a miracle, but miracles have limits. The Americans had built the finest logistical system in history, but even that system cannot conjure fuel from thin air or trucks from wishes. And yet what Patton's Third Army accomplished in those 30 days remained unprecedented. No army in history, not Alexander's, not Napoleon's, not Rommel's, had advanced so far, so fast, while maintaining operational coherence. The Third Army did not simply chase the Germans. It destroyed them. Between August 1st and September 1st, Third Army units killed or wounded an estimated 20,000 German soldiers, captured over 60,000 prisoners, liberated dozens of towns, and advanced farther in 1 month than the entire Allied Expeditionary Force had advanced in the 3 months following D-Day. The cost was measured not in American lives. Third Army casualties during the pursuit were remarkably light, but in fuel, in rubber, in machinery. The Red Ball Express burned out its trucks. The tank battalions burned out their engines. The infantrymen burned out their boots. But they had achieved something no one thought possible. They had proven that speed, when supported by the full weight of American industry and logistics, could be weaponized on a scale the world had never seen. And Bradley, who had unleashed it, who had enabled it, who had ultimately stopped it, carried both pride and burden for the rest of his life. December 16th, 1944. The Ardennes. The snow fell thick and silent, muffling the sound of engines. In the pre-dawn darkness, German forces launched a massive counteroffensive through the forests of Belgium, catching the Americans by surprise, driving a deep salient into Allied lines. It was Hitler's last gamble in the West, Operation Wach am Rhein, the Battle of the Bulge, and for a brief, terrifying moment, it seemed to be working. Entire American divisions were cut off. Supply depots were overrun. Panic spread through the rear echelon. Summoned his commanders to Verdun on December 19th. The mood in the room was grim. Montgomery urged caution, consolidation, a defensive posture. Bradley argued for counterattack, and Patton, who had been sitting quietly, leaned forward and said, "I can be there in 2 days." The room went silent. Patton was proposing to disengage the entire Third Army from its current positions along the Saar, pivot 90 degrees north, and drive into the southern flank of the German offensive, a maneuver that would require moving over 100,000 men, thousands of vehicles, and all their supplies through winter roads in the middle of a battle without losing cohesion. It was the kind of operation that should have taken weeks to plan. Patton said he could do it in 48 hours. Bradley believed him, because Bradley had seen it before. He had seen Patton do the impossible. He had seen Third Army move at speeds that defied doctrine, that rewrote textbooks, that left even the American High Command struggling to keep up. He knew Patton was not boasting. He was calculating, and the calculation was based on the same system that had carried Third Army across France. The trucks, the fuel, the radios, the maps, the unsung logistics officers and quartermaster sergeants, and Red Ball Express drivers who had learned, through trial and fire, how to turn audacity into movement. Patton's Third Army attacked north on December 22nd. By December 26th, they had broken through to Bastogne, relieving the surrounded 101st Airborne Division. By January, they had blunted the German offensive entirely. The pivot, the maneuver Patton had promised in 2 days, became legend. Military historians would later call it one of the most impressive feats of operational command in the war. But it was not Patton alone. It was the system, the infrastructure, the logistics. The same revolution that had carried Third Army across France now carried it through the snow and mud of the Ardennes, proving once again that American warfare was not just about courage or firepower. It was about the ability to move. April 1945. Czechoslovakia. The war was ending. Third Army units crossed into German territory, into Austria, into the remnants of the Third Reich. They moved quickly still, but the urgency was different now. They were not chasing a retreating enemy. They were occupying a defeated nation. The roads were clogged with refugees, with displaced persons, with prisoners freed from camps whose horrors would take years to fully comprehend. Patton, who had spent the war moving forward, now found himself dealing with the aftermath. Bradley, now commanding the 12th Army Group, visited him in Bavaria. They stood on a hillside overlooking a river, watching engineers build yet another bridge, watching trucks roll east in the endless procession that had become the defining image of the American advance. They did not speak much. There was not much left to say. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. Patton's Third Army had advanced over 600 miles from its starting point in Normandy. It had liberated or captured over 80,000 square miles of territory. It had taken over 1 million prisoners. Its casualties, relative to its achievements, had been extraordinarily low. It had done what Bradley had unleashed it to do and more. But Bradley would spend the rest of his life thinking about what might have been, about whether, if he had let Patton continue in September 1944, the war might have ended sooner, whether the Battle of the Bulge might have been avoided, whether tens of thousands of lives might have been saved. He would never answer those questions definitively. No one could. The logisticians said it was impossible. The supply lines said it was impossible. And Bradley, the careful, methodical realist, had trusted the numbers. But Patton had never trusted numbers. Patton had trusted speed. Omar Bradley died in 1981 at the age of 88. In his final years, he granted interviews, wrote memoirs, reflected on his long career. And when asked about Patton, about the advance across France, about Third Army, about that summer when everything seemed possible, Bradley would often pause. He would choose his words carefully. He would say that Patton was difficult, brilliant, but difficult. That Patton's ego was immense, his temper volcanic, his judgment sometimes questionable. He would say that Patton's success was not his alone, that it belonged to the thousands of men who followed him, who drove the trucks and fixed the engines and fought the battles. He would say all of this, and it was true. But then sometimes Bradley would say something else. He would say that in all his years of command, he had never seen anything like Patton's advance, that it had been terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure, that watching Third Army move across France had been like watching a force of nature, unstoppable and incomprehensible, and that in the end, what he had confessed to himself, what he had struggled to admit, even in private, was that Patton had been right about speed, right about audacity, right about the fundamental truth that in war, as in life, hesitation kills more surely than risk. The Americans had invented a new kind of warfare in 1944, not through doctrine, not through strategy, but through the marriage of one man's reckless genius and one nation's industrial might. They had built a system that could sustain speed, that could turn fuel into victory, trucks into weapons, logistics into an art form. And for one brief, blazing summer, they had shown the world what was possible when you refused to stop moving forward. Bradley had unleashed it, and he had never quite forgiven himself for reining it in. There was a road in eastern France, near Nancy, where the remnants of the Red Ball Express route can still be found. The signs are gone now, the convoys are memory, but the road remains, worn smooth by 70 years of traffic, a ribbon of asphalt running through fields that were once battlefields, through towns that were once liberated in a single afternoon by men who did not have time to stay. If you stand on that road at dawn, when the light is soft and the air is still, you can almost hear them. The rumble of engines, the grinding of gears, the voices of drivers shouting to one another over the noise, pushing forward, always forward, carrying the war on their backs, one truckload at a time. And you can understand, perhaps, what Bradley understood too late. That speed is not just a tactic, it is a philosophy, a belief, a refusal to accept that the world moves at the pace it has always moved. Patton believed that the speed of an army could change the shape of history, and for 30 days in the summer of 1944, he proved it. Bradley had given him the chance, and in doing so, he had confessed something deeper than strategy, something more profound than logistics. He had confessed that sometimes the reasonable thing is to be unreasonable, that sometimes the safe choice is to risk everything, that sometimes the only way to win is to move so fast that the enemy, and even your own side, cannot keep up. Patton understood this instinctively. Bradley learned it by watching, and history, which rewards the bold, remembers them both.